The sun, a fiery anvil in the New Mexico sky, beat down on Eli Cade as he meticulously braided a new lead rope. The smell of dust and sun-warmed horsehide was a comfort, a stark contrast to the acrid stench of gunpowder that still, some nights, haunted his dreams. This high mesa, gifted to him by a dying Apache warrior years ago, was his sanctuary, a rugged testament to a fragile peace he'd painstakingly built. Below, in the valley, lay Harrow's End, a town slowly stitching itself back together. He knew Marta de Leon, the formidable saloon owner, was a big part of that mending, her quiet strength a balm on old wounds. And Sheriff Harlan, young and sometimes hesitant, was trying his best to keep the peace. There were even optimistic whispers flowing up the mesa winds talk of a railroad, progress, a future that might finally be free of the ghosts of the past. Shadow, his black Mustang, nuzzled Ellie's shoulder, a soft sigh escaping the horse's nostrils. Born amidst the chaos of war, Shadow had been Ellie's anchor, a constant reminder of the beast he'd once been and the man he was trying to become. Eli ran a hand down the horse's sleek neck, feeling the warmth of life, a stark contrast to the cold steel of the Confederate cavalry saber leaning against the corral post. He'd cleaned it 1,000 times, polished the brass hilt until it gleamed, but he hadn't drawn it in years. It was a relic, a burden, a promise never to spill blood again, unless there was absolutely no other way. He secured the last knot on the rope, the rhythmic pull of the leather a meditative act. The quiet hum of the cicadas was the loudest sound on the mesa, a symphony of peaceful existence that had taken years to achieve. He thought of the young, unbroken colts in the far pasture, their wild spirits mirroring his own once. Taming them, guiding them, was a satisfying endeavor. It was a tangible creation of something good, something lasting, unlike the destruction he'd witnessed and been a part of so long ago. This fragile peace, he knew, was hard-won. He intended to keep it. The peace shattered with the arrival of Sheriff Tom Harlan, his usually flushed face ashen beneath the dust. He rode hard, his horse lathered, pulling up short outside Ellie's corral. "Cade, you gotta come." Eli dismounted quickly, his gaze sharp. Surveying party for the railroad. Slaughtered. Harlan swallowed hard, eyes darting to the mountains. And the signs, Apache symbols, laid out plain as day. A cold knot tightened in Ellie's gut. He'd seen enough battlefield horrors to know when something felt wrong. He grabbed his rifle, holstering it almost by instinct. The scene at Box Canyon was gruesome. The bodies were laid out in a tableau of savagery, but Ellie's keen scout's eye picked out the discrepancies at once. The arrow wounds were precise, almost too neat, and the mutilations, while horrific, lacked the practiced brutality of a true Apache raid. He knelt, examining a discarded spearhead. "This isn't right, Tom. The cuts, the placement of these symbols. It's staged." Before Harlan could respond, a thunder of hooves echoed down the canyon. Cavalry, flags fluttering, rode in. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a predatory gleam in his eye, dismounted with an air of absolute authority. "Silas Knox, at your service, Sheriff." Heard about the massacre. A tragedy. His gaze, chillingly direct, swept over Eli. "You must be Cade." Knox wasted no time. Declaring martial control, he accused the local tribes, and, with a casual sweep of his hand, announced his intention to seize vast swaths of land, including Ellie's Mesa, for the rail spur. The town, already clamoring for vengeance, fell under his sway, desperate for answers and a strong hand. The dust-choked air of Harrow's End hung heavy with a volatile mix of fear and righteous anger. Eli found the saloon already bustling, not with its usual patrons seeking solace in liquor, but with faces etched with worry and suspicion. Marta de Leon, her dark eyes sharp and observant, poured drinks behind the bar, her movements calm despite the simmering tension. "Heard about your visit from our new benefactor," Marta said, her voice low, as Eli settled onto a stool. "Knox ain't wasting time. put his men on every corner. Eli nodded. Accepting the whiskey, she slid across the counter. He wants my land, Marta. He's got the whole town riled. Folks are scared, Eli. They remember the war. Her gaze drifted to where Sheriff Harlan stood, looking uncomfortable as he listened to a stern-faced mercenary in a dusty uniform. Tom's caught in the middle. Just then, the saloon doors swung open, and Whiskey, Jed stumbled in, his grizzled beard dusted with sand, clutching a tattered map. Eli. There you are, boy. Got wind of summon. Heard a few of Knox's cavalry talking about a back trail, a shortcut to the canyons. They ain't just after land. They're looking for something else. Jed winked, taking a long swig from his flask. Ellie's eyes narrowed. Old magic, Jed? Petroglyphs, boy. Tribal secrets. There's whispers of a sealed cave deep in the mountains, filled with old Apache history. Later that evening, after a tense standoff with a pair of Knox's men outside the livery, Eli found himself confronting Sheriff Harlan. Tom, you know this isn't right. Harlan wrung his hands. He's got orders, Eli, from the territory. He's here to take what he wants, and if you stand with him, you'll be on the wrong side of history. Ellie's voice was firm, a challenge. The young sheriff looked away, his indecision a heavy weight in the silence. The scent of dried blood, faint but persistent, still clung to the air in Box Canyon. Eli, accompanied by a grim-faced little crow, returned to the site, searching for what the sheriff, in his inexperience, had missed. Knox's men had patrolled the perimeter, but their eyes looked for Apache signs, not contradictions. Eli and Little Crow looked for truth. They wear the uniform, but they are not soldiers. Little Crow observed, his keen eyes scanning the ground. Eli pointed to a scuffed mark near a clump of creosote bush, partially obscured by a fresh boot print. See that? Deeper than it should be. He followed the faint trail, Little Crow moving silently beside him. A few yards away, tucked under a rock overhang, they found it, a small, tarnished silver locket engraved with delicate roses. It was too feminine, too out of place for a surveying party. A woman's locket, Eli murmured, his brow furrowing. As they circled back towards the main canyon, a glint in the harsh New Mexico sun caught Ellie's eye. Half buried under a tumble of rocks, something caught the light. He dug it out carefully. It was a small leather-bound ledger, surprisingly intact. More damning, however, was a faint splash of deep red on the final page, a blood stain, unmistakable, and beneath it, a date. A date from before the massacre had supposedly occurred. This ain't just an investment book, Little Crow, Eli said, his voice hard. They left the Box Canyon, the ledger a heavy weight in Ellie's hand, but their journey wasn't over. While cutting across a lesser-used path back towards Ellie's ranch, a volley of rifle shots whistled past their heads. Knox's men, anticipating Ellie's movements, had set an ambush. Eli and Little Crow scattered, Shadow neighing in alarm, but staying true. Eli felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed his arm, a hot trail across his forearm. He dove behind a rock, returning fire, but the mercenaries were well positioned, trying to drive him towards the looming shadow of the mesa. They weren't trying to kill him outright, not yet. They wanted to corner him, to send a message. The gunshot wound in his arm throbbed, a dull ache that mirrored the deeper pain in Ellie's soul. He and Little Crow had managed to evade Knox's men, slipping like ghosts through the deepening twilight. Now, in the sparse cover of a rocky outcropping, Little Crow deftly cleaned and bound Ellie's wound with practiced ease, using herbs from his pouch. You ride like a ghost, Little Crow, Eli grunted, wincing as the young man tightened the bandage. Always have. Little Crow paused, his hand still. My mother was Apache. My father, a scout like you. He taught me the trails, the signs. He looked at Eli, his young face unreadable in the fading light. They do not trust you, Eli Cade. Eli looked away, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. I know. I wore a different uniform then. I was a scout, yes, but for the South. He ran a hand over his face. The canyon walls remember more than men do, Little Crow said softly. Ellie's focus sharpened. Jed mentioned something about old Apache secrets, a sealed cave. Is this true? Little Crow hesitated, his eyes scanning the ridgelines as if listening to unheard whispers. There is a place, a sacred cave. My ancestors drew their stories on the stone walls, wisdom for generations, and a ceremonial artifact hidden there. My uncle, the warrior who gave you this land, he was its last guardian. Before he died, he spoke of its importance, that it must not fall into the wrong hands. It is a symbol of our strength, our connection to the land. Eli felt a cold dread. The locket, the ledger, the staged killings, and now a sacred artifact. Knox wasn't just a greedy land baron. He was a destroyer, aiming to ignite a full-scale war. And if the Apache wouldn't trust him, even with this proof, then his path was even harder. He was a man caught between two worlds, a relic of a past that haunted him. He knew he had to gain their trust. But how? Eli and Little Crow moved deeper into the canyons, the air growing cooler, the silence profound, disturbed only by the whisper of wind through the rock formations. The landscape itself felt ancient, holding secrets Eli was only just beginning to comprehend. Little Crow led him with uncanny precision, navigating through a labyrinth of arroyos and narrow passes. They finally reached a hidden alcove, shrouded by an overhang of rock and sparse brush. A nearly invisible crack in the cliff face marked the entrance. The cave of the old ones, Little Crow murmured, pushing aside a camouflage of piled stones. Eli, favoring his injured arm, squeezed through the narrow opening after him. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient, almost spiritual. By the light of a small torch Little Crow lit, Eli saw them. Petroglyphs etched into the dark rock walls. Shapes of warriors and animals, suns and symbols, told stories across millennia. It was a history alive, breathed onto stone. Then, at the deepest part of the cave, they found evidence that Knox's men had indeed been there. Scuff marks on the floor, fresh, clumsy gouges from boots that didn't respect the sacred ground, and a small, crude cavity in the rock, recently disturbed. The ceremonial artifact was gone. But beneath a loose stone, something glinted. Eli reached in, pulling out what appeared to be a small wooden box. Inside, carefully folded, was a map, not of the terrain, but of the cave's symbols, with certain markings circled. This is what they were after, Eli said, a chilling realization dawning on him. Not just the land, not just the artifact. They were looking for a way to twist the symbols, to create their false narrative more convincingly. Just as he spoke, faint shouting echoed from outside the cave. Knox's men, relentless, had tracked them. They were close. Eli looked at the ledger, the locket, the crude map of symbols. He had the proof, tangled with the secrets of the past, but he was trapped. He knew his history as an ex-Confederate scout would make tribal elders suspicious, but he had to try. He had to ride into the heart of Apache territory, not for war, but for an impossible alliance. He had to cross the trust line, hoping, praying, that the truth written on that cave wall and in his blood-stained ledger would be enough. They managed to draw Knox's men away from the cave entrance, deeper into the canyons, before losing them in a chaotic chase. Eli, nursing his bleeding arm, looked at Little Crow. "We need to get this to the Apache elders." Little Crow nodded, his gaze serious. "They will not accept it easily. Your past. It is a dark mark for them. But the truth of the old one's cave, that speaks louder than any man's words." They rode hard for hours, making for the hidden Apache camps deep within the canyons, a place Eli, as a Confederate scout, once would have only entered for attack. Now he was seeking alliance. The tribal leaders, grim-faced and wary, listened to Little Crow's explanation, their eyes constantly flicking to Eli. He felt their distrust like a tangible thing, a wall between them built of generations of broken promises and spilled blood. Eli stepped forward, holding out the bound ledger. This is not Apache work. This is the hand of a man who seeks to destroy you and everyone who stands in his way. He used your symbols to turn white men against you. He opened the ledger, pointing to the bloodstain, the deceptive dates, and then the map of misconstrued petroglyphs found in the hidden cave. He recounted finding the locket and the fabricated details of the massacre that would have pushed the town towards vengeful war. An elder, his face a roadmap of years, took the ledger, his fingers tracing the marks. He spoke in Apache, his voice low and guttural. Little Crow translated. He says your words are strong, but words have been lies before. Eli looked directly at the elder. My blood may be, but my heart is not. I fought for a cause and learned it was built on lies that cost more than lives. I seek to protect what is right now. This land was given to me by one of your warriors, a gift of peace. I will not let it be defiled by a man who understands neither peace nor honor. Knox seeks to ignite a war that will consume us all. The elder's gaze softened, just a fraction. He looked at Little Crow, then back to Eli. The silence stretched, heavy with past grievances and the desperate need for a future. The desert night, vast and star-dusted, held them in its embrace. Eli sat by the flickering campfire, the ledger open on his lap, the locket clenched in his good hand. He spoke, not to the Apache elders who sat in stoic silence, but to the flames, recounting the battles fought, the comrades lost, the creeping realization that the cause he'd bled for was rotten with deceit. The words, choked with shame and regret, poured out of him, raw and unvarnished. He spoke of the idealism of youth, shattered on the anvil of reality, of watching friends die for a banner that ultimately stood for injustice. I was a fool, he rasped, his voice rough. A blind, arrogant fool. I thought I was fighting for home, for honor. But I was just a pawn in a game I didn't understand. And for that, innocent blood was shed. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken histories. Then Little Crow rose and approached Eli. In his hand, he held a small leather pouch. He knelt, opening it to reveal pots of ochre and charcoal paints. He offered them to Eli. My uncle, the warrior who gave you this land. He used these colors, Little Crow said, his voice soft but firm. He knew that a man's path is not always straight. Your blood may lie about your past, about the side you fought for. Eli looked at the paints, then at Little Crow, understanding dawning in his eyes. He took the pouch. Slowly, deliberately, he dipped his fingers into the ochre and began to trace lines on his face, symbols of protection, of courage, of fierce intent. He felt a cleansing fire ignite within him, burning away the shame, replacing it with a resolute purpose. The past was a scar, yes, but it no longer defined him. He was no longer just a Confederate scout, a horse rancher seeking peace. He was a protector. As the sun began to paint the eastern sky with fiery hues, Eli stood. He unhooked the Confederate cavalry saber from its place by his bedroll. The metal felt cold, heavy, but this time it was not a symbol of past allegiance. It was a tool, forged for a new purpose. He strapped it to his side, the familiar waited confirmation of his resolve. Then, turning to the Apache elders, his painted face stern, his eyes alight with a fierce determination, he spoke, not with arrogance, but with a quiet strength. Knox will come for the town. He will come for the land. But he will not have it. Not while I still draw breath. I ask you, not as a former enemy, but as a man who seeks justice for all, to stand with me. The gauntlet had been thrown. The air in Harrow's End crackled with an unnatural stillness. Knox, confidently arrogant, had called a town hall in front of the saloon, intending to formalize his stolen claims, to force the townsfolk to sign away their futures. His mercenaries, arrayed like a mocking honor guard, stood ready for any resistance. But this time, resistance was waiting. Eli, his face streaked with war paint, his saber glinting at his side, watched from the shadows of the livery. Beside him, Sheriff Harlan, his youthful face now set with grim determination, held his rifle. Harlan whispered, glancing nervously at the saloon. Eli just nodded. The moment of truth, for everyone, had arrived. Knox began his pronouncements, his voice booming across the dusty street. Your salvation is at hand, citizens. As he unfurled a massive land deed, Eli gave the signal. From the ridgeline overlooking the town, a chorus of Apache war cries echoed, drawing every mercenary's attention upward. It was the diversion they needed. Eli roared, bursting from cover, shadow a black blur behind him. Harlan, yelling orders, opened fire, targeting the closest mercenaries. The surprise was absolute. Bullets whizzed, men screamed, and the staged quiet of the town fragmented into chaos. Marta DeLeon, a shotgun cradled in her arms, emerged from the saloon, her face resolute. She yelled, and a ragged line of saloon patrons, armed with everything from old hunting rifles to rusty pitchforks, followed her, laying down a defiant line of fire. From behind the general store, a cart laden with suspicious barrels came rumbling into view, pushed by a cackling whiskey Jed. He announced, igniting a fuse. The explosions ripped through the center of Knox's forces, sending horses rearing and men scattering in panic. Eli, saber in hand, carved a path towards Knox, who had taken refuge on the roof of the saloon, drawing a large hunting knife. The duel was brutal, a clash of steel and will. Eli fought with a desperate ferocity, memories of every lie, every stolen life, fueling his strikes. Knox was strong, but Eli moved with the unburdened purpose of a man who had nothing left to lose. Eli's saber, old and battle-worn, finally cracked against Knox's knife. The blow sent shards of metal flying, leaving him disarmed. But Eli, fueled by instinct and the grim knowledge of cavalry tactics, used the momentum to his advantage. He ducked, grabbed Knox's wrist, and twisted, throwing the surprised land baron off balance. With a final, powerful surge, Eli hurled Knox from the saloon roof. The mercenary lord landed with a sickening thud amidst the burning wreckage of Jed's explosives, consumed by the very flames he'd helped ignite. The fight was a blur of smoke and desperate cries. Below, Sheriff Harlan, his face streaked with powder, rallied the townsfolk, pushing back the remaining mercenaries. Marta, shotgun smoking, stood like a defiant sentinel at the saloon's entrance. Jed, having exhausted his dynamite, was now gleefully pelting the retreating enemy with rocks from a bucket. On the ridgeline, the Apache warriors, having completed their flanking maneuver, descended like vengeful spirits, their arrows finding their marks with chilling precision. But Ellie's world had narrowed to the rooftop, to the primal dance of life and death with Silas Knox. The setting sun, a bleeding wound on the horizon, painted the scene in hues of orange and violent red. Knox, a feral gleam in his eyes, lunged with his knife, a brutal, efficient thrust. Eli met it with the flat of his saber, the clang of metal echoing across the frenzied scene below. The air thrummed with their struggle. Knox fought with the cold precision of a predator, every move designed to kill. Eli, his movements fueled by righteous fury and a lifetime of honed instinct, parried and dodged, seeking an opening. He remembered training drills from a lifetime ago, the muscle memory kicking in. He was a scout, a rider, a fighter, but this was different. This was justice. Knox feinted right, then jabbed left, catching Ellie's arm. A searing pain flared where the knife grazed him, but Eli barely registered it. He pressed his attack, driving Knox back towards the edge of the roof, the smoke from Jed's inferno rising around them like a hungry beast. Then came the impact. Ellie's saber, pushed beyond its limits, struck Knox's knife with a final, desperate clash. A shard of metal flew past Ellie's eye as the old Confederate saber, the symbol of his past, splintered and broke, leaving him disarmed. Knox smirked, his eyes gleaming with triumph, raising his knife for the killing blow. But Eli, years of cavalry training ingrained in his very being, knew a broken weapon wasn't always a defeat. As Knox lunged, Eli ducked under the swing, seizing the man's wrist with his injured hand. He used Knox's momentum, the man's own overwhelming strength, against him. With a powerful, Desperate pivot, Eli pivoted, twisted, and threw. Knox's eyes widened in dawning horror as he sailed over the edge of the saloon roof, silhouetted for a fleeting moment against the flaming wreckage Jed had created. The mercenary land baron, the architect of so much suffering, crashed down into the inferno below, devoured by the consuming fire, his empire of lies and greed perishing in the flames. Eli stood on the rooftop, chest heaving, the broken hilt of his saber still clutched in his hand. Below him, the sounds of battle began to fade, replaced by the shouts of victory and the crackle of burning wood. The dust settled slowly over Harrow's End, the acrid scent of gunpowder and smoke replacing the usual smells of horses and mesquite. Knox's mercenaries, those who hadn't fled into the night or succumbed to the Apache arrows and townsfolk's fury, were rounded up by Sheriff Harlan. The young sheriff, no longer hesitant, moved with newfound authority, ordering his deputies to secure the area and tend to the wounded. The ledger, recovered from one of Knox's fallen men, was pressed into Harlan's hand, indelible proof of the land baron's machinations. In the days that followed, the truth unraveled. With the ledger as evidence, territorial authorities were summoned. The fabricated land claims were nullified, and Knox's railway investments evaporated. The railroad, its reputation tarnished by association, rerouted its line, finding a path that bypassed the Dead River Valley, leaving Eli's Mesa and the Apache lands untouched. Peace, a fragile, hard-won peace, began to settle once more over Harrow's End. The town, however, was fundamentally changed. The ordeal had stripped away its complacency, forcing it to look inward. They had fought for themselves, side by side with an ex-Confederate and their Apache neighbors. Eli watched from the edge of town, the paint still faintly visible on his face, the broken saber hilt tucked into his saddlebag. He saw Marta de Leon, no longer just a saloon owner, but a recognized leader among the townsfolk. He saw Sheriff Harlan, standing taller, his gaze steady, a true lawman now. And he saw Little Crow, his half-Apache brother, walking with the tribal elders, bridging the gap between their peoples. The ranch on the high mesa, the place of his fragile peace, would be in good hands. He had ridden for justice, had found redemption in defending those who couldn't defend themselves, and in doing so, had healed a part of his own wounded soul. But his fight was done here. His peace was not to be found in staying, but in riding onward, a shadow against the setting sun. He mounted Shadow, the black Mustang, a silent, powerful presence beneath him. He glanced back one last time at the town, at the mesa, at the vast, forgiving desert. Eli rode out of Harrow's End as dawn painted the eastern sky, shadows whose stirring whispers from the trail. He knew his presence, a reminder of the raw struggle, would eventually hinder the town's newfound quiet. His purpose here was fulfilled, his debt to the land and its people paid. He looked back once, to the smoke curling from scattered chimneys, to the figures already beginning to move about the streets, rebuilding. Peace was a fragile thing, but Harrow's End now knew how to fight for it. He rode by the base of the high mesa, and by unspoken agreement, turned Shadow toward the faint trail leading upward. Little Crow waited at the ranch, a silent, knowing figure against the rising sun. Eli dismounted, offering the reins to the young man. "It's yours, Little Crow," Eli said, his voice soft. "The ranch. The horses. Keep them wild, keep them free." Little Crow nodded, his gaze meeting Ellie's, a depth of understanding passing between them that transcended words. "The spirits of this land know you, Eli Cade," he said. Eli simply clapped him on the shoulder, a silent farewell. He took one last look at the corrals, at the familiar stretch of land that had been his sanctuary. It was time for a new one. Then, with a final glance at the broken saber hilt in his saddlebag, a palpable change came over Eli. He didn't ride back the way he came. He turned Shadow's head towards the distant, jagged line of buttes, a wild, untamed expanse stretching into the horizon. He wasn't running. He was riding towards something unknown, something that called to the untamed part of his soul. Shadow, sensing the shift in his rider, surged forward, who's beating a rhythmic tattoo on the hard earth. Eli Cade, the haunted scout, the stoic rancher, began to shed the remnants of his past with every mile. He was no longer Eli Cade of any fixed place, but a wanderer, a protector, a shadow in the making. Whispers, carried on the desert wind, would follow him. Tales of the man who rode with a haunted gaze, who fought for justice when others chose greed. The man who wore the paint of a past enemy to forge a new future. The man who appeared when needed, then vanished into the vastness, leaving only legends in his wake. He rode into the deepening blue of the desert, a solitary figure against the boundless sky, becoming a song, a tale, a whisper in the wind. The last shadow rider. They say the desert never forgets the blood it drinks, but sometimes it forgives.